Hi, everybody. I'm Phyllis Fast, and I am here to talk about my own artwork, and I'm talking about mixed identity, mixed descent. I myself am a person of mixed descent and taught here for many years in anthropology as well as in the liberal studies program. And one of the things that I found is that in the time that I was a teacher here, that if I didn't be very clear, and a Native person who was in the class coming from a different tradition than mine could become very confused. So I had to make sure that I identified myself for the purpose of saying I am only an Athabascan of mixed descent, not somebody who is from a specific village. It was helpful to be that clear about it, and then we could move forward. They could make their own internal decisions. Often students at the various campuses that I taught at would then come at me privately later and identify who they were, where they came from, how they were descended. And it started a dialogue. So I encourage any professor who has mixed descent of any sort to say so. And there's all kinds of ways to be a mixed descent, as they call it. Okay, I am also an artist, and I'm going to lift up here for the purpose of the camera the cover of a book I recently wrote called Half Beat of Fundy, and the cover is one of my paintings. So I've, as you can see, possibly, on this particular slide, this is a painting that is done in a very expressionistic style. It's not perfect. It's not realistic. I don't go for that kind of thing, and in other words, I'm trying for the emotional qualities, the intellectual qualities, and the color qualities, and also for the impact. I try to express my feelings about any subject on this, and I'm going to be talking about this in a bit, so I'll leave that for later. I am now looking at my slides, and I know you're not, so I'm just going to say that here. When I was beginning my adulthood in my early 20s, I did a painting which was actually a collage where I paper mache type of thing. I had no idea about the artwork that went with Alaska Native people. And so I bought Bill Holmes' book on Northwest Coast art. But I myself am not from the Northwest Coast. I'm from the interior, and I'm not Tlingit or Haida, or I'm not a Tsimshian person. So I didn't know that. In my early 20s, before I became educated through the university system, I didn't know that there were other kinds of Alaska Natives. So I was happily making this collage out of paper mache using torn magazines, and it's something that I truly enjoyed. I enjoyed making this gorgeous thing that I thought was kind of neat, and then I realized that I needed to pay attention to some of the aspects of the art by looking at Bill Holmes' instructions. It's very how-to-do Northwest Coast in his book, if you've never read it. And I realized that I needed to have certain features, like a triangle that represents the fin, and it's separated and that sort of thing, and there's a certain dynamic that goes on in the doing of the art. A dynamic that I didn't know about. The artwork I've done has been either my mother taught me or I learned it in grade school or in college. I learned much later that not only was Northwest Coast far removed from where my mother came from, and she came from, by the way, the village of Rampart, and my grandmother came from Tanana. So we're Yukon River Indians, not people of the ocean, which is what Northwest Coast is a coastal area on the Pacific Ocean. And so what Bill Holm expects to see in that sort of thing is ocean fish. And so his explanation of what everything was, like the triangle for the dorsal fin, were all about various fish you see down in the ocean, which I had no idea about. Not only that, but I'm allergic to fish, so I don't eat it. Me being from a river, though, I knew what salmon looked like, and so at some point I said, well, it does need to have a head. It has to have eyes, and so I used his ovoid construction. His fish had this sort of a beak-like thing. I don't know why. And salmon sort of have a curved upper jaw, so I did my salmon, not knowing that I was doing a salmon from a river in the Northwest Coast style. And that is very mixed descent. It's a mixed way of doing art through art. It's betraying my own mixed descent in many ways. And since this is for educational purposes, I'll just go ahead and say, if you are a faculty member, you see a student doing something like I did, and I know that you too cannot see this picture I'm talking about, but I will show you. You've seen it on my walls, various walls.
You can't see it because it's got your
oh, too black. Ooh, hello there.
covered with.
There. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. That it really would help to just let that not be something you point out as you're doing it wrong. You're just indicating that you might be from a different background and go on with life rather than telling the student that they are very incorrect. Well, I went on with learning how to do, and I'm now on slide 3, I guess, of my PowerPoint.
Well, Professor Fest, did somebody alert you to these inconsistencies, or did you notice them later on?
That's a good question. I didn't notice them until I took Northwest Coast, an introduction to it, as a student when I was in my 40s. And I had already done that by when I was in my 20s. So I had no idea what Bill Holm was talking about in terms of culture, except I just didn't know. I thought it was Alaska Native, and therefore I should have done it. And so that's where I learned it. Then when I took the course, the official course in Northwest Coast Native people, I realized at 20 years later that I had made a huge mistake. And it really is helpful to take all these courses, because then you learn the breadth of being Native American and that you're part of a larger multiple continental framework. Okay. Actually, in that respect, I didn't know, for one thing, Dr. Williams is just here. She's a musician and has her background is in music. She's the one who said at one calm time about 15 years ago, and of course she's talking in a mixed group like this, and she said, of course you all know that there's a certain drum style that goes with almost every single Native American. And I had heard the drums, I had heard the kind of beat, and I did not realize that it was, you even find it in South America. It was something that huge. And I didn't know that, so taking a course or 20 really helps. Okay, so instead what I did was, a slide now is called Painting, what I know about homemaking. Well, I was still in my late 20s by this time, and I had taken a few watercolor courses, no anthropology. And I did all kinds of watercoloring. I was trying to make things in a certain way with recipes, and somebody brought, she didn't show me how to make it, but she showed me in writing her recipe for making an avocado dip. She calls it her ugly dip, and her name was Anne. So it's called Anne's Ugly Dip, and I made a watercolor of the recipe. I never made the recipe. I think the recipe was delicious, but it's totally outside of myself. I used watercolor, which is not indigenous. I used pictures of plants that are not grown in the wild, like avocados, cucumbers, bell peppers, and tomatoes, onions. We don't actually have them in the wild out here in Alaska. Something similar can be like mushrooms, but not those particular ones. As an early artist, I didn't know those things. As an informed anthropologist, taking the undergraduate courses in those things, I learned that I was making mistakes. So my point here is that not only was I pasting on an identity on top of myself, this Anne's Ugly Dip is not even my recipe, and I didn't actually make it. I enjoyed eating it, but it's not me. So somewhere after I began taking courses in Native Americans, Steve Langdon, who taught at that time, had so many courses that he taught, and he was one of the first ones in the mid-1980s teaching courses like that. Now they've become something that we teach kind of automatically. Well, I began, because I wanted to be a professional artist, I had no idea that I would actually become a professional anthropologist instead, and I have to attribute that to Dr. Langdon. I started drawing my family, and so what I've got here is a slide called Drawing Anchorage, but it's actually drawing my own family. My niece Ariel, pictures of the museum, and the third picture is an abstract of some sort of tractor that was outside a window where I worked.
Dr. Fest, before you start talking about your family, can you talk a little bit about why you're using the term mistake to refer to things that are inconsistent with your cultural heritage? They're consistent, seem to be consistent with your experience, having, one, read a book, and two, eaten something, a recipe that you enjoy. Why are you calling these mistakes?
I'm calling them mistakes now, many years later, because I didn't know that I was not talking about anything that had to do with my Alaska Native culture. That's a good, very pertinent question. Those were part of my background, part of growing up here in Anchorage, things that I knew about, but I also knew I was Alaska Native. When I first began taking courses from Dr. Langdon, for instance, I just knew that. I am Alaska Native. I didn't know deeper. I didn't know about our fabulous map, for instance, and where I fit in it. In the personal way, family way, I did know that, well, Mom came from Rampart, Grandma came from Tanana, and it's on the Yukon River. See, you can see the Yukon River on this map, any old map of Alaska. But now that I have become educated, I know that it is a mistake to be so simplistic. Does that cover it? Thank you. Okay, so this Drawing Anchorage, moving into my 40s, was an introduction to some of the things that I needed to begin knowing, and I'm more or less narrating a life of Alaska Natives, and I thank you for pulling me back to center on that one. The life of an Alaska Native doesn't necessarily come with all of the stuff that an anthropologist might know, somebody who actually knows the names of these things. Well, my next slide is called Depression. It's actually then subtitled, or Trying to Finish a Dissertation at the Same Time, because one of the things that happened to me taking courses is that I became inspired to really understand myself, and to I'm laughing because half my audience left.
She is paying attention. She just has to close the door.
Oh, okay.
She's here.
So, but I brought the slide out because I do know that depression is one of the factors that is a serious issue for most Alaska Native people. So at some time, we as students, or we as just living the life of an Alaska Native, where the ordinary daily experience, unfortunately, is one in which an unenlightened person on the street will say, "Oh, you're not Native, you don't look it," or "You're Native?" And they have this ugly face on their big frown and that tone of voice that makes it seem as if it is not pleasant to be a Native person. Well, that does lead to depression. And I was extremely depressed when I was in my 30s and 40s, not knowing that a center part of that depression came from being denigrated almost every single day for being what I am, a mixed descent Alaska Native. Somebody who can pass for white or be Native and pass for Native in any community, and especially in my family. So one of the things I was asked a few minutes ago is, should somebody self-identify? Would it help if students self-identified? It's harmful. It is actually, if you want to bring on pain, that one of the good ways you can do that is to self-identify in naivete, not knowing exactly who you're talking to. So I would actually advise any faculty member to do it in private, kind of encourage it by asking something about their background, and then moving on from there, allowing the student to make up their own mind about what they are in their own identity. Well, painting was a fallback for me at all times. And somewhere in my late 40s, I did a painting called Looking for a Past. It's unfortunately one of those that I sold, and therefore I don't have it anymore, but I hope the person who I believe lives in Missouri enjoys it a lot. It's a picture of layers and layers and layers of images drawn on a circle. And one of the things that you might notice in Native art is that we do a lot of things with circles. Okay, so one of the pictures there it's trying to depict what I'm actually looking for and why, because I don't think that this is a common solution for most people, is to look for your past in some way. And my method of looking for my past was to search through myself using my artwork. And as some people might know, and I have found through my life, there is really something to being both right-brained and left-brained. That when I use my right hand, and I'm left-handed, so when I use my right hand, it emphasizes the power of this. I can see and talk with my hands about a subject that is painful to talk about out loud with words, or in the left brain mode. The left brain mode is very verbal, very linear. It's very programmed for outline learning and not for creative, abstract, or expressionistic learning like I do in my art. And so usually when I am painting, I will start it with my right hand. For most people who are right-handed, there are artists or teachers who will say, use your other hand, your non-dominant hand, which for many means use your left hand. Doing so evokes within you thoughts you never knew you had, understandings you never knew you had, and so this painting of looking for a past told me many of the things that I didn't know I was searching for. So one of the things that you can see in it is, besides the centralized use of circles, it's my own hand, my own right hand, that is, or non-dominant hand, that is being shown here, kind of to emphasize the use of the non-dominant hand or the non-verbal side of yourself. For most people, it would be the left hand that would be shown in that. I found myself looking deeper and deeper and deeper into the past, verbally as well as non-verbally. Well, another thing that I did was, still before I understood that there were differences among Athabascans, that there were, in fact, 11 different Athabascans in the nations within the state of Alaska. I didn't know that early, and so my mom was very gregarious. She had a lot of Dena'ina Athabascan friends that she had made over time, and I knew them too, and we visited a lot. Well, I had just assumed that I'm Athabascan, that's Athabascan, we're all Athabascans together. Dena'ina they have a different language from my own past, which I'll get to in a few moments. It's different. My mother couldn't speak it, my grandmother didn't speak it, and I didn't realize that I wasn't Dena'ina. The Dena'ina, in the historical way of being Dena'ina, is to forgive any young person who doesn't know their own past. So they didn't explain to me, because that's very rude in our own customs, that we could have done it better. They didn't explain anything about me making a mistake by assuming I was Dena'ina, but I wasn't. I had to learn that from, guess who? Well, it was actually Dr. Workman. It was here at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. Well, I learned a lot from the anthropology department about how to become erudite about learning my culture. That's not something that an ordinary person is likely to do, but it does help. When I was accepted into Harvard University, I was flat out shocked, because I was in my 40s. I had all kinds of mistaken notions about who I am and what the world is about. And so first, I was a woman, so women never went to Harvard. My mind was filled with all of these crazy, stupid thoughts. There are lots of women at Harvard. I thought that being 40 means that you are over the hill, and there I was, not only accepted, but given a lot of encouragement in other ways, financial ways, scholarships, and so forth, to go there, no matter what the age. And what I thought they must be assuming that was that somehow I was knowledgeable about my background. Well, I wrote in my letter of application, I'm Athabascan. I don't know much about my Koyukon background. I want to learn more. And they were really impressed that I was so overtly honest, and they encouraged me to come and do some more research in that very issue. The painting that I've got here is images of Adina, and I painted it as a celebration of graduating from Harvard University. What it is a serpent mound in Ohio, and I know that you have some relationship to that part of the world, not Ohio specifically, but is Iowa? Yeah, Iowa. And so I have no relationship to Ohio. I have no relationship to Iowa. But what I did find of specific interest was through the education that I got at Harvard University and in the native courses that I took, was that there were these commonalities. A commonality of symbolism, of snake symbolism, that I knew from having done so much work in the museums in Alaska, both Fairbanks and here in Anchorage, as well as the PBI Museum at Harvard. That what I was seeing, those particular shapes, were shapes that I knew in a core part of me because I had seen them all my life. Okay, so the thing is, the background that I have doesn't have a whole lot of visual imagery. My grandmother made all kinds of beaded things. She made money for the family when she became a widow, that we lived on her beadwork, or my mother did, and then later I did too, of her being able to do beadwork and that sort of thing, traditions, but it's not exactly the kind of artwork that I do. Well, what I did find, were Koyukon stories. My mom had told stories, my grandmother had told stories, and there are several sources now of old stories that other people have told and had written down, and they had it in the translation form, in the language, which used to be called Denake. It is called Denake by some people now, and now it's referred to as Koyukon. Those stories gave me an entirely new understanding of who I am, because I knew the stories, I just didn't know that I had permission to know them as me. And I tell you what, it sounds so foolish to be so old and to have permission given by somebody who has no relationship to being Alaska Native. But it happened to me. My next slide is called Intergeneration, and I forgot the AL, Intergenerational Trauma. And my friend, Dr. Jackie, who is sitting right beside you, she was instrumental in reading early drafts of Half-Beat of Fundy, my first book, and said, you should be talking about intergenerational trauma, or it's also called historic trauma. And I said, well, it's a little too late since I've done this, but I better get busy, because that's what we're swimming in now, is the whole problem of intergenerational trauma. So I named this one Midnight Trauma. It's about a lot of situations in which you can see and understand how it affects people on the inside to have trauma. And one of the basic issues that I bring out is that if people do not have the, I was tempted to say the word courage to self-identify. That's really wrong. It's assuming that there is something that they should be doing, such as being courageous, but the daily life of an Alaska Native person is my life, and I think that's why we have so much trouble now, is that in subtle ways, we who are of not the white American way are subjugated, denigrated, and treated with ways to make you more poverty-stricken. In other words, you don't get the job if you happen to be overtly Native. Now, on the other hand, on that word courage, you don't get that courage until you actually learn some of the methods that have worked for other Native people. And now at 70, I can say, well, yeah, I finally learned them. Well, yes, I finally learned them, but I wish the next person could learn it at 7 or 17 or whatever, way before I ever did. And so that's one of the reasons I'm talking about it. Okay, but the book here, The Half-Beat of Fundy, the whole point of this book is that in many societies, not every society, there is a tendency to want to dominate a person through an invention of racism, where the race may be invented on the spot, may be traditionally there for decades or centuries, or may be something that is convenient and may be completely not part of the biology of the person who is so labeled a person of mixed identity. And this is where I am completely dumb and feel like, and I should have, I have it on the other tape, a little passage that comes late in the tape about a fellow named, in this book, his name is Zondan, and it's a story about how Zondan, who was orphaned at 2, this is fiction, and who is 14,000 years old by my depiction, was orphaned. His cousin, all of the old age of 9, was there raising his 2-year-old little cousin. Well, you can't do 2 things at once. You can't take care of a 2-year-old like you should, like, you know, they need a lot of food, they need to be cared for, they shouldn't run off and go on their own. Somebody needs to be there watching that 2-year-old, and you can't do whatever it takes to hunt. They're hunters at that time, I have depicted, and you can't go off and hunt and get food for that little 2-year-old and raise him at the same time. So, as I describe somewhere in my book, and I actually read the passage, that was what I was looking for a few minutes ago, a woman of what I call the Hootlan, or a very short native person, happened upon the pair, the 9-year-old and his 2-year-old cousin, and said, I'll make a deal with you. In that I invented a custom where if the old woman could actually get him adopted into the family that she was in, she benefits and gets, taken care of by the family, along with the little 2-year-old kid. Well, that's a good deal. He said, I'll do it as long as I have unlimited access to my cousin. And she said, yes. Well, my depiction of that particular time frame is that there were 2 basic kinds of people. The 7-footers, which is what Zondan was, the little 2-year-old and his cousin, and the short 4 to 5-footers, who were the Hootlan. And so Zondan grows up in this family of Hootlan, thinking all this time that he's a Hootlan. And then when he got, an adult size, he's 7 feet tall, and they're still way back there in height. He believed firmly that he was a half-breed, that he was actually somebody of mixed descent, and that it just so happened that he was a little bigger than his very short adoptive parents. So it was one of the examples of being a half-breed, a mixed descent, where it's entirely mental in the mind of the person, Zondan. The family that adopted him loved him. He was just a perfect guy, big enough to beat up anybody. Love that, they in my novel. And big enough to hunt things they couldn't do. And then I also have invented these Tutsado people as having mental powers beyond anything that exists, and so they could just knock off any old animal by thinking, die, creature. Anyway, okay, that's my imagination working, not reality. But I did have that, and so they loved him for what he offered them. He didn't know, never knew, died not knowing that he was fully Tutsado. He was never a half-breed. So that was one example I had of that. And I had many of the contemporary person, this is the novel in which the contemporary person happens to be a 21-year-old Vinake, or the way that it's said nowadays is Koyukan person. And of course she is young and beautiful, but I was sort of playing with, if I were young and 21 again, I'd be like her. And so I depict her like that. She goes through a lot of adventures in her half-breed state, and what I did with her character was give her a white American father who abandoned the mother, happens quite often, unfortunately, no matter who the woman is. And so she ended up raising her child all by herself, which is not native entirely, but it is ubiquitous for many women everywhere. Okay. I have her asking, in this particular novel, which I really wrote as an effort to explain what a half-breed is, so that's what the pun in the title is, not half-bead, spelled like the beading, but that is one of the stereotypes of being native, is beading. Half-bead Fundy is, I try to put her in situations in which her half-breed nature and cultures makes an impact on things, and she encounters people of these mixed descents throughout the book. And so she's constantly asking her spirit guide, whom I've named Basi, which means thank you in the language, what these are. And so, as is probably well known for any anthropologist or people who will work with Native people, there are many, many ways that a person can be labeled or simply be part of 2 or 3 different cultures, both biologically as well as culturally, and it does affect them depending on what that is. So my last slide here is a picture of the second novel in this series. It's called Midnight Trauma. Midnight Trauma is one which deals with the consequences of mixed descent often, but it's not necessarily that. There's so much drug usage, alcohol usage, or simply depression that I wrote about in both, made it more specific in this second book. And what's important about this particular one is it too has this it has a slash. A person can either choose to get into the drug area and other things and be, as I depicted it, a person who is out of it, or else get into it and find some kind of other reality going. And so I hope that we eventually get to there. Anabasi. That means thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is it the same heroine that you have in both books? So is it a continuation?
Yes. Both books have Dalu, which means, well, I picked it out because I could spell it and people can pronounce it. It means she's cute. And I have her with a spirit guide, and the encounter between the two of them is part of the half-beat of Fundy, explaining how that ever happened, and that she has one in the first place, and that spirit guide is named Basi. And the way I explain it through half-beat of Fundy is that a lot of kids anywhere grow up having an invisible friend. It's not every kid having this sort of thing, but Dalu had an invisible friend, and her mother discouraged her from having that invisible friend. No, Delu, you do not have any invisible friend that we can't see. Just have your real friends. It's the way that worked out in the book, or often it happens. And then in this book, though, I think I found the passage for that. I have them coming into a place. They were actually coming to the Bay of Fundy, which is a real place in between North America and the Maritimes. Okay, this is the spirit guide pretending she is talking. She has never talked with her adult guidee. Using commune mode is a standard spirit guide technique. Most mortals don't know that we are talking to them all the time. They think they are authors of every flickering thought. I had kept up a running commune monologue for years, but Delu never listened. So now, of all times, she unplugged whatever had stopped her from hearing me before. Delu braked the car, head snapping. She looked for the speaker, fearing the ridiculous innkeeper had jumped into her car. The innkeeper isn't somebody who died. Delu got out of the Passat, examined the back seat. She couldn't see the back seat itself, having crammed it with things that didn't fit into the trunk. Delu slid back into the driver's seat and thought about what she'd heard. She had the distinct impression that a woman had spoken, not a male, not her late husband. Our lives changed in that instance. So that was my way of introducing the concept of spirit guide.
I also had a question when you mentioned you were talking about your own background, having grown up in the Anchorage area in a Tenina environment, but at the same time you are from a Koyukon region. What would be your advice to students or people who are watching this video, growing up Alaska Native in urban environments, whether it's Anchorage or a hub, knowing that originally their family comes from somewhere else, but yet they don't live there, they don't grow up there, they live in an urban environment. How can they connect with those areas?
Okay, there are now in the 21st century, there are a lot of ways to do it. And one of them is to go to the museum downtown or any museum and actually look at what's on display. Often I saw in the Anchorage Museum things that my grandmother made, beaded objects, and it is sort of like feeling something. I didn't have a place to put it in my mind, just a memory. Oh yeah, Grandma used to do these. I didn't put it into context with any course. Nowadays you can take a course in Alaska Native Studies, the Introduction to Alaska Native Studies, and that would help a lot if you happen to know somebody who's Alaska Native or are Alaska Native in some capacity.
What about the environment for many Alaska Native cultures, being connected to the local environment and knowing about it and learning about it is something that's pretty much guiding everyday life.
Yes.
So somebody who is growing up in urban Alaska, how can they have a similar experience? How can they learn about that? Do you have any suggestions?
Oh gosh, that's a very open-ended thing, but it usually devolves to food, and to pay attention to the food that somebody might bring to you from home. I got a lot of, when I was growing up, a lot of people came from the villages out on the Yukon River, and their rent, so to speak, I mean, they would offer my mother some meat or something that they had that came specifically from the middle part of the Yukon River. And I never paid attention to it. I didn't have a context. It would help if they actually asked a little bit more about it. So the onus has to be on them to know that they have that opportunity that many other people don't have. The downside of what you're asking is almost impossible. It's the assumption that soon the dominating society will overpower any differences and everybody will be of one culture, which simply doesn't happen. But it's an assumption that a dominating culture can have. Now, that was very true of me when I was growing up. Unfortunately, it seems to be still around, but not as much as when I was a kid. And part of that is because you are one of the professors who will ask in a meeting, probably, or simply tell people to be watchful of that thing. So I'm taking the onus away from the student and asking you as a professor to teach your fellow professors. I know Ann does, and she's not a native person. It's something that the University of Alaska Anchorage began about 20 years ago, and we profited from it. It's something that Fairbanks started in the 60s. They actually had somebody teaching something about Alaska Natives. Unfortunately, he had a huge disconnect between himself and people of mixed descent, meaning that if I wanted to find out more at that time, which is in the 1960s, he would actually say, "Oh, I'm sorry, not you," and look at the person who happened to be darker skinned and actually came from a village. Again, I'm going to put the onus on the professor. They need to learn first, and then the students.
When you were talking about your experience of going to Harvard, and so before that, learning about your Alaska Native identity,
Mm-hmm.
Going to Harvard, it sounded like that it opened up a totally new sort of connection to many other, not just Alaska Native people, but Native Americans and also indigenous people. And you were describing the one painting with the snake.
Mm-hmm.
Finishing at Harvard and coming back, how did that change your view of looking at your own life, but also Alaska Native people and cultures?
Okay. Well, first of all, when I was at Harvard, and there was at that time, I think it's still ongoing but bigger, a club for Native American students.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a club where we only had a room to meet in, a room about, that size, and there were a lot of us who were in there, and we had to sit literally butt to butt and shoulder to shoulder just to be there, and we did. We were there at least once a week, if not every single day. I'd stop by, and sure enough, there'd be somebody. We just talked to each other. I was one of the few from Alaska. I got to meet all of these people who had something in common with being with me, and so it was a very helpful experience. It also erased issues of ageism. I was in my 40s at that time, and they were 20 years younger at least, and they didn't care. They wanted to be close to what was like them. And for many, that meant being just Native, no matter what the quantum was. Okay, so your last part of there, how did that impact me, was a freedom from feeling different because I was less biologically Native than other people, and a freedom from being the old woman, because by the time I started teaching I was 50, and Native people actually treat elders better So that was a real positive experience coming back. So there were many other things that happened, many opportunities to talk with educated Native people who are in other tribal situations who have made these accomplishments. And there were, at the time, this was in the 1990s, many changes legally had already happened, like the Native American Graves Protection Act was 1990. That was the year I got into Harvard. The Casino Act was something that started and was enacted in 1988, 2 years before I got to Harvard. So there were accomplishments that happened, and I was introduced to them and their context and what context it had for the people telling me about it. So there was a lot of information that I could share with my students in Alaska that came from those club meetings that I didn't have any other access to.
Another thing that kind of went sort of weave through your talk, looking at contemporary Alaska Native art, and not simply looking at traditional forms of Alaska Native artworks.
Yes.
Combining maybe non-traditional materials with contemporary art, or maybe looking at different variations of it. And so I know that oftentimes people look at museum pieces that are exhibited that were collected maybe 100 years ago, but there's a very vibrant contemporary Alaska Native art scene and many artists who are exhibiting. Can you talk a little bit about that? Who never met, you never seen any contemporary Alaska Native art. Your view of how to appreciate that art.
Okay, well, we're in a century where that is just exploding. There are artists for the past couple of decades, artists who are punk rock singers, and they incorporate that kind of dancing and speaking and shouting to the microphone into their artwork, which is also visual, static, two-dimensional things, but they also do it, and I'd like to say names, but I'm going to beg off and say, 70, I don't have to remember any names. Nick Galanin comes to mind, who was one of the first to do dancing of that sort, and he's from Southeast, so he incorporates Northwest Coast artwork imagery, but not entirely into his artwork. It's really exciting. Also from the Northwest Coast is another artist of the 21st century, Singletary, I forget his first name, who works in glass, blown glass, various glass forms. Oh, it's so gorgeous. Well, those are people who in the 21st century were enabled by people like me of the 20th century to just say, various exciting words. Let's just bust out the walls and do artwork. A woman who is, I think she's a little younger than me, her name is, again, she's from the Northwest Coast. She is Tanis Hensley. She is, she does portraiture in paper mache, but she does, like me, and I think we are people who influence each other. We evoke, rather, through these two-dimensional forms, that kind of imagery, so that we're incorporating some of the older forms of two-dimensional artwork. And so, like me, Tanis Hensley puts beadwork on her masks. They're almost Northwest Coast in design, but they have a haunting quality about them that says a lot more about the actual experience of being a Native person. For her case, my case is of the 20th century. In the Singletary and Nick Galanin and so many more, it's of the 21st century. You can really see how being of mixed descent has had a dramatic change around the turn of the century. Does that answer that question?
One of the things I like to ask everyone who is presenting, we have a lot of native students and we have a lot of non-native students who are both going to work with Alaska Native communities or Alaska Native organizations here in Anchorage or urban centers. What would be your suggestion for going out and starting to have a successful career and to start out successfully in this particular career of collaborating with Alaska Native communities?
That's a wonderful question for somebody like you, and I know your husband as well, because you begin that life being very open and open to change and open to possibilities. So one of the things that a person can bring if they're not native or only partially native or whatever they may, just a cityfied native, can bring to a community from the larger environment is that knowledge. Knowing how to wait in line or make the phone calls, or actually knowing somebody from a bureaucracy. Knowing how to get changes made that a village person may not have any experience doing. So that knowledge of dealing with bureaucracy and that tight way of controlling the lives of people can actually be smashed down or opened up by somebody who has had a background in working at the post office and knowing that if you don't do X, Y, and Z in X, Y, and Z order, you don't get anything done. But often the person who's raised in the city knows those formulas. And that's what I would suggest. You bring something, and it doesn't have to be a can of some sort of candy or whatever. You bring your knowledge.
So it's sharing something.
Yes, and being willing to spend the time to share it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And did you have any-
Well, you're probably coming to the end of what you want to say. But one of the things that I think is quite interesting about both books is that the spirit guide, who is quite ancient, has experienced historical trauma herself.
Yeah.
Do you want to say something about that?
Okay. One of the problems with having a book, and I made this book. There's one great internal story from this book that is what you're talking about. And I'm just leafing through the pages, I wouldn't be able to find it. But I did try to do that exact thing often, so that not only do you see my version of contemporary examples of traumatic things happening on the scene, which unfortunately I've seen too many of, you can go into my imagination of the past, ancient past, and envision a situation, and this was a situation which I had, the character's name is Najutlan, and he was just 9 years old when it happened. That invaders came, I termed them the death runners. The habit of the death runners was to invade the country that they were running it through as death runners. They had their agenda. It was never explained to the local people. What they actually did was butcher and maim and kill people without explaining anything. And they used various body parts as a trophy. Well, he was at that age. In other words, they used the developing man's testicles as proof that they had become men themselves and conquered the world. I had the guy being rescued by an imaginary kind of creature who raised him. And he then told the story to others many times once he got over the trauma. The thing is, I had him go through a period of not being able to think about it, not being able to react to anything for years. And so, in Alcoholics Anonymous, one of their lessons is don't talk about it, don't hear about it, turn your ears off of it, don't think it. Well, he did that. Without being told to do that, he just couldn't remember that he had witnessed his mother being murdered. And then Basi, my spirit guide, was one of the people that that heard the story. And in my story, I have her remembering it in vivid detail 14,000 years later. And her comment to her character, the one she's guiding, Delu, is that memory, that trauma, which wasn't even her trauma, was so impactful on her very ancient life that her way of thinking, her way of being had it had consequences in the way that she behaved, the way that she interpreted events around Delu's life. That actually made Delu's life a little bit worse than it would have been if without a guide like her. So my point is that there's a spiritual component to historical trauma that impacts, without the person's ever knowing it, the person. And we don't know exactly what that could be. My interpretation is that it could be a spirit guide who is so old that they have that impact.
Thank you.